You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome, everyone, to a webinar entitled In Vitro Fertilization and the Sanctity of Human Life, presented by Dr. Craig Turczynski and Dr. Anne Urlakis, with Q&A moderator Laura Elm. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I'm the director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Sister Mary Lang will offer our opening prayer. Sister Mary describes herself as a woman in love with our Lord, having followed him for 46 years as a missionary of charity, founded by Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta, the last 7 years of which she has followed him out into the world to serve the unborn as a new religious order called the Infant Jesus Society. Sister Mary.
Thank you, Sebastian. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, in your infinite wisdom, you have willed into existence every single human being, however tiny and whatever the circumstances, and have desired each and every one of us to spend eternity in your embrace of love. Grant, we pray, a fresh outpouring of your Holy Spirit upon mankind, that we may weep for those we have imprisoned in canisters of nitrogen at IVF labs, and mourn for those we have disposed of as medical waste. Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May they rest in peace. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sister Mary. In this webinar, we will present two speakers on the topic of in vitro fertilization. Our first speaker, Dr. Craig Turczynski, will speak on assisted reproductive technology and how it violates natural law and causes harm. Our second speaker, Dr. Anne Urlakis, will speak on the sanctity of life, in vitro fertilization, science, the church, and bioethics. To begin our webinar, I'm pleased to announce our first presenter, Dr. Craig Turczynski. Dr. Turczynski is the Director of Strategy and Scientific Affairs for the Billings Ovulation Method Association, USA. Dr. Turczynski is trained as a reproductive physiologist. He directed the IVF, andrology, and hormone assay laboratories at LSUMC Shreveport and was assistant professor of OBGYN. Dr. Turczynski left his academic post in 1999 after having a crisis of conscience. He observed the harm art caused to patients, and this experience drew him closer to his faith and church teaching, art being assistive reproductive technologies. In 2018, he joined BOMA USA and became a certified teacher and trainer of the Billings Ovulation Method. He is also a provider on My Catholic Doctor. Dr. Turczynski serves on the board for Sacred Heart Guardians and Shelter and is a scientific advisor for Natural Womanhood. He is currently completing a certification in healthcare ethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center and completing a research and education fellowship with Dr. Phil Boyle of Neo-Fertility. Married for 31 years with 3 children and 2 grandchildren, he lives on a small farm in North Texas, where he enjoys the culinary experience and health benefits of producing farm-to-table food. He believes in the intersection of virtue and science and aligns himself with organizations that seek the root cause of disease and therapeutic cures. The title of his presentation is Assisted Reproductive Technology Violates Natural Law and Causes Harm. I now present Dr. Craig Turczynski.
Thank you, Sebastian. It's definitely a pleasure to be here with everybody. This is actually my first time attending the ITEST, so I'm just very excited and thrilled to be here, and hope that you will enjoy my presentations. I did want to point out that the information I'm sharing today is related to the paper that Marianne and myself and my daughter, Alexa Dodd, just published in the Lineker Quarterly. And so I didn't put a lot of references in the slides. You can find the references for this material in that paper, as well as more details on the information. So I'm going to start with the objectives. I hope to share what the IVF experience is like for patients through the lens of a former assisted reproductive technology lab director. I want to share some behind-the-scenes observations that led to my crisis of conscience. Hopefully help you to understand the top 5 ways in which art produces disorder and harm, and then demonstrate how the consequences of art reveal a disordered approach and how natural law provides the explanation for the lack of human flourishing. So just to share a little bit more about my background, I'm not an ethicist. I'm a baby in studying ethics. I'm from the Midwest. Originally, I grew up on a farm and I went to Iowa State and studied animal science. From there, I moved to Texas to complete a PhD at Texas A&M University in reproductive physiology. So there we studied reproduction in animals ranging from mice to humans, and we applied technology, including hormone analysis, sperm, egg, and embryo collection, cryopreservation, IVF, and cloning in animals. But then when I graduated, I took a turn to the dark side, and I went on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship doing both NIH-funded basic research and learning how to run a human IVF laboratory. After I completed that postdoctoral fellowship, I took my first faculty position at Louisiana State University Medical Center in Shreveport, Louisiana, where I directed the assisted reproductive technology laboratories. And I was also the chief embryologist for the program. And I did all the techniques, most of all the embryology techniques, including the one you see pictured here, which is ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. So I spent a total of about 7 years in the field. Our program at LSU did about 100 to 150 IVF cycles a year, so it was a mid-sized program. We had good live birth rates for the time, which was approximately 1 out of every 3 to 1 out of every 4 couples who came to the program actually successfully left the program with a baby. We did all of the procedures, except we did not do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is becoming more common, has become more common in the field. So I want to try to help you understand the process of IVF from both the perspective of the patient and from the provider. Most importantly, the patient, of course. And I know there may be some on this webinar that have either experienced the conventional infertility process themselves, or they may know somebody, you may know someone close to you who has. I hope that my presentation today does not open any wounds or upset anyone. It's important for people to understand that this is not a judgment, and it's not a condemnation of people who have struggled or used the technology. Babies born from the procedures, of course, are precious and deserve nothing but respect, love, and dignity. Infertility is a painful condition. and the struggles that couples have should never be dismissed or taken lightly. My hope is that my experience can help others understand that IVF is not the answer, and there is a better way. Moral medicine is good medicine. So I like to use the analogy of a roller coaster. You've probably heard it used before. It's a very good analogy for the process that patients experience when going through IVF, except that it's a very sadistic roller coaster ride. And so I'd like to explain to you an example of a couple who went through our program when I was there. So this couple went through a total of 4 IVF attempts. But of course, most patients, before they even come to IVF, they have attempted, say, 3 to 6 intrauterine inseminations. The woman would have had hormone analysis, an HSG to check for blocked tubes, probably laparoscopy, surgery for endometriosis or fibroids. And the man would have probably had at least 1 semen analysis, but that's pretty much it. Very little is done for the man in terms of trying to solve his subfertility. So this was a couple in their 30s, and they had what we call unexplained infertility, which just means we didn't know what the cause of the infertility was. At first, they're very excited. That's common because a couple's taken a very active approach to solve the problem. And each step in the procedure then produces either a high, so, high, or a low based on the outcome. For instance, at first they're high, like I pointed out, and then the number of follicles that the woman produces during the stimulation process was good. The eggs looked good at retrieval, so they're still at a high. And then even higher, the appearance of the eggs and the sperm at insemination were also very good. By all indications, it appeared like this was going to be a very successful procedure. But then the next morning, when we went to check for fertilization, there was complete fertilization failure. None of the eggs had been fertilized. So there's a deep plunge that the patients experience when this is reported to them. The outcome's over and it's final. So they proceed to a second attempt, and this time they're hopeful because we're going to use intracytoplasmic sperm injection to ensure fertilization. At the time, we didn't routinely do ICSI on every couple. It was only if there was a male factor and everything looked normal with this particular husband. So they are high now because we actually did achieve fertilization. But then over the next few days, there's a plunge again because the embryos are not developing very well. There's lots of fragmentation, and the couple is provided a picture of their embryos. However, over the next couple days, the embryos continue to develop. So hopes are high again. And then even after the transfer, and a few weeks later, there's a positive pregnancy test. So now the couple is very, very excited, very hopeful. But then a few weeks later, when ultrasound is used to validate the pregnancy, there's a deep plunge because the implantation is not viable. The embryo has resorbed. They move on to a third attempt at IVF, somewhat less enthusiastic at this point, and they have the exact same outcome. So they're pretty much very discouraged at this point. Our program at this point advises the couple that there's probably some unknown male factor. So even though the sperm appeared normal, there's some biochemical or genetic issue going on with the man's sperm. And so we recommend donor insemination. So the patients go away and they contemplate this for a while, and they come back deciding to do the donor insemination, but they don't want to completely give up on the chance that the man, the husband, can father the child. So they decide they want us to inseminate half of the eggs with the man's sperm and half of the eggs with the donor sperm. So we do that. We end up with 2 embryos from each father. Those 4 embryos are transferred, and they end up with a pregnancy that goes to term. Now, of course, without genetic testing, it would not be known who the father was. And the couple decides that's actually what they prefer. They don't want to know who the father is. And I'll expand a little bit on the consequences of that and later on in the presentation. So you can see over a period of several years how there's ups and downs. And this particular couple ends up having the baby. But many couples, and in fact, most couples don't actually have the baby. They go through this trauma. They don't get the baby. And there could be even more trauma, things like ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy that doesn't resorb on its own intrauterine, and the woman has to go through a D&C. So there are many things that can occur during this process. And what I would like to do is share those with you. What are some of the things that are the consequences of ART? So to explain my experience, you have to understand that even though I was a cradle Catholic, I was pursuing helping couples, heterosexual married couples, have a healthy baby. And you can argue that having the baby is a good and holy aspiration, but as Mary Anne identified when helping me with the paper, was that attempts to justify the means of IVF in the everyday clinical routine became ethically problematic and morally unsatisfactory for me. My goal for this presentation is to illustrate this personal struggle that I had through the disorder and harm that I observed. And I organized this into what I call the 5 undesirable consequences of assisted reproductive technology, or the top 5 ways in which art produces disorder and harm. These are often not discussed. These side effects, if you will, of the art process is not frequently shared with couples when they are considering IVF. Number 1, multiple pregnancies. During my time and up really until the late 1990s, it was routine to transfer 3 to 5 embryos, mostly 5 embryos. The subsequent rate of multiple pregnancy came at an enormous price. And most hospitals that had large IVF programs also needed to have a NICU, neonatal intensive care unit, and the number of NICU beds increased by 138% and neonatologists by 238% during this time. Now, twins would usually be acceptable, but anything more than 2 implantations, the couple would be given a recommendation for selective reduction. A selective reduction is when 1 or more of the fetuses are injected with potassium chloride that kills them. Some couples will even do genetic testing, determine the sex, and then choose what sex or which fetus to inject. Fortunately, it appears that the field has largely corrected the multiple pregnancy issue, because now greater than 90% of the births are singletons. But what we don't know is how many of those singleton births are due to selective reduction, because they don't report that. And I suspect that some medical directors are very aggressive in how they encourage the use of selective reduction, because they don't want the stats. They're treating their statistics. They don't want to see the complications. Number 2 is abandoned embryos. I believe now there are millions of frozen embryos in storage, and they're increasing daily. Many of the embryos are abandoned by their parents, leaving the disposition of those embryos to the laboratory. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine ethics guidance is that a program can dispose of the embryos after reasonable attempts to contact the parents have been made. And nowadays, consent forms, very detailed consent forms are completed that permit the lab to discard or use the embryos for research in this case, or the patients themselves can select this option. So I wanted to take some time to crunch some numbers, and just to give you an idea of the annual embryo cryopreservation and death of embryos in the United States. So from the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology, you can glean that there are about 250,000 fresh starts to IVF, but that you have to subtract out the frozen embryo transfers cycles because those embryos have already been produced. This produces about 2 million oocytes a year, based on data that shows that the average number is about 9. These are fairly rough numbers that you can easily quote. This then results in about 125,000 embryos that are transferred, resulting in about 50,000 babies born every year. This is also from the literature, but I also crunched some numbers from the statistics and came up with about the same number, upper 40,000 babies born every year in the United States from assisted reproductive technology. This leaves about 1.5 million, what we call spare embryos, and about 2/3 of those are cryopreserved. So about 1 million embryos every year cryopreserved, leaving 1/3 or about a 500,000 discarded, experimented on, or die. So the number of human lives sacrificed is equal to a mid-sized city annually just in the United States. Now, there are some potential solutions, including embryo adoption. This, of course, has not been decided on by the church, and there are moral implications. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine, they recommend or say that programs can decide whether or not to offer compassionate transfer. Compassionate transfer is the transfer of the embryos when there's virtually no chance that they would implant. This, of course, is not morally licit. There could be a way to incubate the embryos to viability, or they could stay in cryo storage indefinitely. Now, I don't want to get into this is a discussion all to itself. I'm not going to get into a lot of details here, but we know that there are some programs like Snowflakes that offer services for embryo adoption. We also are aware because of Laura being present, and we're going to talk a little bit about Sacred Heart Guardians. It's not a solution for frozen embryos, but at least it provides a place for deceased embryos to be given a sacred burial. And I could tell you as a past provider, this is a powerful witness, because when you present this to a provider, it really rocks their world, because they no longer perceive a connection between embryonic life and humanity. So number 3 is the risk to the health of the mother and a child. To me, this is the most significant argument against ART. It doesn't require starting with Catholic teaching to persuade a couple not to pursue art. And there's now a large body of evidence demonstrating adverse outcomes to the woman and the children. But it is confounded by the variables of multiple pregnancy and the known risk factor of infertility, which is associated with health issues that can influence the outcome. So when comparing the data, it's very important that these variables are controlled for. So even when controlling for multiple pregnancies, so only looking at the singleton IVF births, the results are clear. There's an increase in adverse perinatal outcomes. This includes gestational hypertension, the literature ranging from 50 to 100 times more prevalent. Gestational diabetes, 43 to 120% higher incidence. Preeclampsia, 70 to 170% higher incidence. But there's also interesting statistics in that when the variables are matched and controlled for, things such as health issues, it suggests that the women who pursue IVF have a higher incidence of comorbidities. Again, getting to the fact that restoring health is what's important here. Preterm delivery, 50 to 120% increase. And then hyperstimulation syndrome affects about 0.7 to 1.7% of the cycles. And if you do the math, this can be as much as about 4,000 women are subjected to the a very dangerous condition of hyperstimulation. It's most often happens to women who have PCOS because IVF does nothing to treat PCOS. It's an excessive ovarian response. It causes super high estrogen levels, causes vasodilation, capillary permeability, fluid buildup, severe abdominal pain, difficulties breathing and urinating, and it can be fatal. And women who experience this, if they are not hospitalized before the retrieval, can have as many 30, 40, 50, I've seen as many as 70 eggs retrieved from one woman. And there's one of the more startling reports that I came about when doing the paper was this report that came out of South Australia. It was a statewide database for all births, live and stillborn, in South Australia from 1986 to 2002. It included about 327,000 births, 6,000 of which were assisted reproductive technology. They found that singleton ART pregnancies were twice as likely to result in stillbirth. And the infants that made it to live birth were more likely to be born preterm, way less, and die as a neonate. Now, there were also some other interesting observations that demonstrate that we really don't fully understand what's going on with this technology. When frozen embryo transfer is used in the woman, she is not under super high levels of estrogen from the stimulation process. So when frozen embryo transfer was used along with ICSI-produced embryos, the adverse outcomes were removed. Again, indicating that the hyperstimulation process could be affecting things. And also, ICSI relates to the health of the man more so than it does the woman. So a healthy woman who's not under high hormones, these adverse outcomes don't happen. But the other, maybe even more alarming thing is that frozen embryo transfer increased the risk of macrosomia, so an excessively large fetus. And it points to the fact that there are epigenetic changes potentially going on with these embryos in the process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Health of the children. Most of the data indicate the couples who use IVF can expect about 30 to 40% higher risk of birth defects. And this could include craniofacial defects to the eye, ear, and face, or to the other organ systems, nervous, genitourinary, digestive, circulatory, and musculoskeletal system. The abnormal birth size is typically smaller than normal, but as I pointed out, you can also have abnormally large. And the neurodevelopmental disorders include things like cerebral palsy and autism, but these observations are also confounded by the fact that infertility can lead to these. Clearly, again, bypassing health issues that result in subfertility are not in the best interest of the patient nor the children born. So epigenetic changes. These are changes not to the DNA or to the genes, but how the DNA is expressed. So how the DNA, for instance, is the methylization of the genes. The most of the older IVF children now are probably in their 30s. So Louise Brown is the oldest. Obviously, she's in her 40s. So we're just getting to discover these things, that once these offspring reach adulthood, there's higher rates of cardiometabolic disorders, higher body fat, blood pressure, altered lipid profiles, and glucose intolerance. Now, we believe that, again, it could be related to the stimulation procedure, where the woman is under supraphysiological estrogen levels at the time of implantation. But it also could be the in vitro manipulation of the embryo or the embryo culture. Number 4 are the legal and social challenges. So whenever you combine multi-party reproduction with storage of gametes or embryos, and then you have divorce, separation, or even death of a partner, you just end up with these very bizarre social problems, moral dilemmas, and custody battles. And the best way for me to kind of demonstrate that is by giving you the titles of actual cases. Some of them during my time. I saved the literature from when I was in the field. So I have those examples. New Jersey court orders frozen embryos destroyed. This has happened more recently too, where the couple has embryos frozen, they get divorced, and then they have a custody battle over the embryos. One wants to use them, the other one does not. And so the court steps in and decides to destroy them. That's the proper way to deal with it. An appellate decision denies visitation in a baby mix-up case. This happened during my time, where a woman received embryos not just from her, but from another couple who was having embryos transferred that same day. So they end up with being pregnant with twins, one of them biologically theirs, the other another couple. And the only reason they knew was because it was a different race. One child was white, the other one was black. And so they immediately knew something was wrong. They had it genetically tested. And then they identified who the actual parents were. They tried to settle the situation amicably. It went to litigation and became a real big mess. Colorado doctor relinquishes license but refuses to acknowledge impregnating patient with his sperm. This is it happens multiple times through the years. There's anonymous donors, and program directors decide, well, rather than me trying to find and pay for anonymous donors, I'll just use my sperm. So it's pretty common, actually. Former medical student sues alleging donated sperm misused for excessive number of offspring in nearby areas. Why is this bad? Let's say in a big metropolitan area, and one single donor has several offspring, several children who grow up, they meet, they fall in love, they get married, but it turns out they're actually half siblings. And then first birth from posthumanously obtained sperm. This was again during my time. in this particular instance, the man died, and then they collected the sperm. The woman had the sperm collected immediately at the time of death, and then was used to inseminate her. A spin on this is when there have been cases where the couple was just engaged, and the man had frozen his sperm earlier, and the man dies before they get married, but now the woman, the fiance, wants to use the man's sperm for offspring, but the family doesn't. So again, litigation ensues. And this is just an example of the disorder. And honestly, you just can't make up some of the things that happen. So let's move on to social issues. This was a study put out by Elizabeth Marquardt and her colleagues from the Institute of American Values. It's about the lives of adult offspring of sperm donation. And I'll just share this slide really quick to orientate you to. They looked at 3 social problems with the law, mental health problems, and substance abuse problems. And this would serve as the control. These were offspring or children, adult children that were raised by their biological parents. So there is some rate of these social problems, obviously. They also looked at adopted. I don't know anything about how these adoptions were done. There's obviously a right way to do this and a wrong way to do it. So I don't really have the data to drill down on that. But these here, the remaining 4 are all donor-conceived children at adulthood. And based on when they were informed about being donor-conceived children. The bottom line is when parents either postpone informing the children, or worse yet, they attempt to keep this a secret, telling the child a lie, basically, for their entire life, it results in a higher incidence of mental health problems and other social problems. You essentially cannot keep this truth from your child, your loved one that you spend time with day after day. It's impossible to do. What donor-conceived children, adults of children, frequently say is that what hurts the most is the fact that they know their parent, one parent, either the father with donor sperm or the mother with donor egg, decided to father them or mother them, and they did it for money and then chose to have nothing to do with them. That's mostly the case with donor sperm. So I think it's important to know how aggressive organizations like the American Society for Reproductive Medicine are in promoting immorality. They are very politically active, and they promote policies and fund other organizations that drive their agenda. This is recent. They have now lobbied to be able to have all federal insurance carriers to provide coverage for standard fertility preservation. Fertility preservation commonly was thought of when a man or a woman of reproductive age needed to have, say, cancer treatment that could render them infertile. So the thought was we'd freeze their gametes, and then they survived the cancer, they would still be able to father or mother, have a child. But they're expanding this now to include infertility associated with medical and surgical gender transition treatment. So basically, sterilization, being able to preserve the gametes before sterilization. The ASRM has very heavily promoted the transgender agenda for many years. After all, sterilizing people ensures the need for their technology. This was a podcasts with an individual called Tristan Reese, and I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but this is Tristan. Remember to love the person, but hate the sin. And this is Tristan's activism coming to a school near you. And then number 5, human experimentation. The pursuit of technology and human experimentation continues to be aggressive. Instead of research that might result in treating root causes and restoring male and female reproductive health. I don't want to get into details here just because of the time, but ICSI itself was really a massive experiment because ICSI was first routinely used in humans before it was really successful in animal models. So all of this disorder and harm I observed caused me to question the premise that I was really helping people. And Dr. Urlakis really nailed it when she identified that attempting to justify the aggressive use of the technology and the everyday application of it was ethically problematic. So while I was struggling with these issues, a more personal moral conflict ensued. It led to my final crisis of conscience. We had a patient that came in who wanted all of her eggs inseminated. That's routine. We always, the couple in the lab always wanted the most number of embryos to choose from, so could lead to success. But what this couple wanted was to take any spare embryos after the 1 or 2 that was transferred. They wanted them to simply be discarded. And the patient's physician, who was also my superior, insisted that I carry out the patient's wishes. And a ethics committee of the hospital subsequently also backed up this approach. I essentially was forced to do it. I went along with it. We essentially left the embryos in culture until we could no longer support their life, and they eventually died. I was very repulsed by this, but not like you would expect at first. In fact, I would describe my initial reaction to be like that of an artist that was commissioned to create a painting, and then the client requested it to be thrown away. But fortunately, my Catholic faith also enlightened my conscience, and being forced to intentionally allow embryos to die led to an irreconcilable conflict. And so when I sought out found other work, I left the field. And that was in 1999. So at the time, I didn't even know what natural law was. I knew of church teaching. I may have read a little bit on it. But before I knew what natural law was, there were some things that were revealed to me. Children are a gift. You can't demand a gift, and it's not your right. A gift is not something you achieve with your will or by working harder. We frequently had couples who came in who were very professionally and financially successful. They had careers, nice homes and cars, but they didn't have a child. And they approached this goal like everything else they did, the can-do attitude. And just, if I work hard enough, I can do it. And that doesn't work when you're trying to have a child. Following God's plan for your life does not guarantee a child, but it does increase the likelihood. So loving heterosexual married relationship, avoiding sexual promiscuity, and being open to life early does improve your chances of becoming pregnant. And then working outside of God's plan gets very messy, as I pointed out. And notice I'm using the words God's plan. And again, I'm using the language that I had at the time because I didn't understand natural law. Surrendering to God's plan and being open to his will brings more peace than always getting what we want. And then no matter how much we know or learn, there will always be more that we don't know, and there will always be room for a miracle that defies science. It wasn't until later, after spending time reading both the Bible and the Catechism, that I finally realized the wisdom of church teaching, and I'm still on that journey. It's what led me to study natural law. Natural law is that thing that enlightened my conscience. It's engraved on my heart by God. It's unchanging and binding is the definition. So I looked up the word binding. It means to hold together, like a binding of the book. Cannot be broken, or if it is broken, it's enforceable. There are consequences. And from Princeton professor Robert George, natural law draws us toward human goods, intelligibly choice-worthy for their own sake. Things like friendship, knowledge, age-appropriate, family, health. This grandfather wouldn't be able to spend time with his grandson if he didn't have his health. Love, nature, and life itself. The fact that these are good don't really have to be taught to us. And in a judicial system, we would recognize laws that are consistent with natural law to be just. We don't have to be taught what is just. We just know it. So I guess because I'm so practical, or maybe because I'm just beginning to learn about ethics, it seems to me that not following natural law and instead pursuing evil would lead to the opposite of human goods, like disorder, harm, injustice, confinement, misery, deceit, distress, financial distress. So these things, as Robert George states, we can either flourish or fail to flourish in our biological health and well-being, our intellectual health and well-being, our moral and spiritual health and well-being. So the ends don't justify the means. The ends of the child is always a human good. They are innocent, and they deserve to be given love and dignity regardless of how they came about. But even though the children are a holy aspiration, it is never okay to use evil means to achieve it. From Dr. William May, if the object is not in conformity with the order of reason, it is known not to be, then it will be the cause of badness of the will and will debase us morally. For a human act to be morally good, the object of the act, its ultimate end, and the circumstances in which it is done need to be freely chosen and in conformity with the order of reason. That's from John Paul II. The object of art, or the object being the immediate end freely chosen, is to circumvent the unitive and procreative purpose of intercourse, and therefore circumvent the cooperation with God in the begetting of the child. Therefore, the worthy end of having a child does not justify the means. It is natural law that elucidates art as a disordered approach, because the disorder and harm caused by art is not consistent with human reason. The technology does not orientate one to human flourishing. The principle of autonomy, on the other hand, that many believe are so important in the healthcare system, seems to justify doing harm to oneself. Would it make sense to follow a principle that can lead to consequences that are frequently harmful and only sometimes successful? I believe using the argument of natural law, which does not even require belief in God, is perhaps a better place to start the argument against art than quoting church teaching, which can then be brought up later. Human reason can lead someone to understand the wisdom of the church, like what happened to me, and eventually they can make the connection that doing good and avoiding evil is what is best for us. Moral medicine is good medicine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Turczynski. And now I'm delighted to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Anne Urlakis. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Dignitatis Persona Institute for Nascent Human Life, a charitable organization committed to the mission of defending and promoting the magisterial teaching regarding the sanctity of every nascent human life, particularly embryonic nascent human life, from the first instant of conception to natural death. She holds 3 graduate degrees in philosophy and bioethics and is currently pursuing a 2nd doctorate in theology from Pontifex University. Dr. Urlakis' work involves continued research, particularly within the scope of the history of medical ethical praxis, the philosophical and theological underpinnings of sound moral reasoning, and the value of virtue ethics in natural law. She is staunchly pro-life and advocates for the rights of vulnerable human persons, specifically those at the edges of life, the unborn, the terminally ill, and the elderly. As a secular member of the Order of Discalced Carmelites, Marianne has an abiding love of contemplative prayer and spirituality. She is a writer, speaker, WCAT Catholic radio show host, and member of the board of Sacred Heart Guardians and Shelter. Dr. Urlakis has been married for 32 years and treasures her vocation as wife and the mother of 10 children, 8 living, as the most cherished of her roles. The title of her presentation is Sanctity of Life, IVF, Science, the Church, and Bioethics. Dr. Urlakis, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here this morning. Thank you, Dr. Turczynski, for the exceptional presentation, and it has truly been an honor to work with you on this. As I begin to launch this portion of the webinar, I'd like to pray a prayer that I wrote several years ago for my WCAT radio program. Dear God, our Heavenly Creator, you are the author of life and truth, the reality that you will each and every human person into being, created from the moment of conception, bearing the dignity and imprint of your own image and likeness within the very essence of our being, is a mystery beyond human understanding. Please help us to have a greater appreciation for the gift of being created in your image and likeness. Help us to reverence that reality in our brothers and sisters, especially in the tiniest and most vulnerable among them. Help us to defend the sanctity of every human life from conception to natural death. And we ask this through the intercession of Our Lady, the ever pure and all immaculate Blessed Virgin Mary, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, this morning I have some objectives. I'd like to define bioethics and distinguish between secular and Catholic approaches to bioethics, discuss the anthropology of the human person, define IVF, and explore the magisterial teaching regarding IVF and assisted reproductive technologies, and then explore some of the salient issues and later address your questions. At the core of bioethics, what is bioethics? The academic specialty of bioethics is relatively new on the pedagogical horizon. It's less than a century old, and in this short span of time, this fledgling discipline has been afforded a great deal of authority regarding matters of life and death, and has been a formidable force in areas of public policy. But at the core, bioethics can be seen as a field of study which engages in the work of philosophy, law, medicine, politics, technology, and life science to grapple with the ethical dilemmas regarding the nexus of each of these constituent disciplines. Technology is racing ahead of man's ability to comprehend the scope of its unintended ethical consequences. But at its very core, respect for persons is essential. The study of bioethics involves an interplay between both the theoretical dimension and the practical dimension of life. Prior to 1927, the field of academic bioethics did not exist. Yet in less than a century, this discipline and the areas of study and debate which encompass it have become intrinsic to our understanding of human life and its frontiers. Unfortunately, contemporary bioethics often attempts to distance itself from any theological context. Questions of ethics at the edges of technology and life, both in the beginning of life and its natural biological end, are often divorced from the theological. when we do this, we end up with a subjective and relativistic context instead of looking at God's plan. Contemporary secular bioethical theories are competing. We have numerous theories of contemporary bioethics and ethics, numerous ways to reason. There's deontology, which is a duty-based approach. There's utilitarian, which looks at the greatest good for the greatest number, but we have problems defining who the greatest number is and what that good is. Principle-based bioethics and feminist ethics are among the top contenders. In 1979, Beecham and Childress first published their now watershed text, Principles of Bioethics, Biomedical Ethics. It's now in its 8th edition, and it has shaped secular biomedical ethics more than any other approach. This is the normative approach that has been taught and is taught in medical schools, nursing programs, allied health schools, and graduate programs in bioethics. Beecham and Childress argue that there are 4 prima facie principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, and that these arise out of a common morality, and that the act of balancing and specifying these principles and obligations creates this cohesive whole and a legitimate framework for moral praxis in bioethics. This principle-based approach rejects natural law, which in turn, we've discussed natural law, and I'll delve into it more in just a little bit, about natural use of the light of reason that God has given us, and a natural law being written on our hearts. Interestingly, when I first was a student of bioethics 30 years ago and began to pour through Beecham and Childress's then 4th edition, I think, natural law was still mentioned in the text. It was still in the appendices in the index. Now, in the 8th edition, it's not even there. It's not on the radar. It's not mentioned to students as even a possibility. The principle-based approach, rather than grounding human reason or a single monistic absolute principle, Beecham and Childress champion a pluralistic approach to moral reasoning. And they argue that their theory takes its basic premises directly from a common morality. It's unphilosophical common sense. Specifically, Beecham and Childress have worked to develop an accepted ethical framework that is independent, that works outside of natural law. Their objective is to show how ethical theory can illuminate the problems of healthcare and overcome the limitations of past formulations like natural law, but also overcome ethical responsibility. The principles of beneficence and non-maleficence are also central to natural law theory. They're equally central to natural law theory and the principle-based approach. Yet while the principle-based approach denies that any principle is preeminent or discoverable by reason, natural law, in contrast, recognizes the first principle of practical reason is simply to do good and to avoid evil. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa. As Catholics, we understand that there is indeed a natural law written by Almighty God on the heart of every human person. It's eternal, it's immutable, and it's binding. As the natural law is written within each of us, and it is intrinsic to our very humanness, the knowledge that the human person is a unique, sacred entity from the first instant of its existence, because it bears the image and likeness of Almighty God. It is created by love, in love, for love, with an eternal destiny and an immeasurable dignity. Regarding natural law, quoting Pope Leo XIII's encyclical, I'm going to mess this up, Praestum Terris Imum, sorry for my massacre of the Latin scholars out there. The natural law is written and engraved in the soul of each and every man, because it is human reason ordaining him to do good and forbidding him to sin. But this command of human reason would not have any force of law if it were not the voice an interpreter of higher reason to which our spirit and our freedom must be submitted. The Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches that natural law present within the hearts of every man is established by reason. It is universal in its precepts, and its authority extends to all men. It expresses the dignity of the person and determines his fundamental rights and duties. Natural law transcends space, time. It is accessible to every human person from the beginning of time to the end of time, by virtue of the faculty of reason, even in those who as of yet do not believe in God. While its application varies widely, it takes account of various nuances of culture and conditions. It remains binding on all human persons. It is immutable and it is permanent. And that's the teaching of the Catechism. Rooted deeply within the natural law is the principle that human life is sacred. It is a gift from God, created in the divine image and likeness, and it is to be protected and respected for its own sake. It is never to be used as a means to an end, and this is binding from the initial moment of existence to its natural end. The Church teaches, from the moment of conception, the life of every human being is to be respected in an absolute way, because man is the only creature on earth that God has wished for himself. And the spiritual soul of each man is immediately created by God. His whole being bears the image of the Creator. Human life is sacred because it involves the creative action of God, and it remains forever in a special relationship with the Creator, who is its sole end. We know that the dignity of the human person is rooted in the creation of it being created in the image and likeness of God. And Catechism teaches us that it is fulfilled in his vocation to divine beatitude. Therefore, it is essential for every human being to freely direct himself to this fulfillment. By man's deliberate actions, the human person either does or does not conform to the good promised by God and attested by the moral conscience. No other people have claimed to have such an intimate and personal relationship with the divinity as to bear its very reflection within the individual human person, and by virtue of this unmitigated privilege to exist in a covenantal relationship with the divine. In contrast to the covenantal kinship, which flows from the unique relationship that each and every human person possesses by virtue of being created in the divine image and likeness, ancient pagan cultures understood their gods to be created with human characteristics, while human beings merely existed to serve their mundane and material needs. But no kinship existed between them. We're different. Our understanding of the human person is ancient. It is predicated upon our understanding that the human person is created such that from the inception of his being, he reveals the manifestation of the Imago Dei, the divine image present within his soul and body, a manifestation which in turn divulges this unique covenantal relationship that he has with his Creator. It is this axiom that from the first instant of creation, both the individual history and again reiterated in the conception of each and every individual, the human person echoes the purposeful imprint of the Imago Dei. And this has remained an intrinsic characteristic of Christianity. We know that the desire for God is written on the human heart, and this is because man is created by God, for God, and God never ceases to stop drawing man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and the happiness that he's searching for. Central to this recognition that the human person is sacred and created in the image and likeness of God and that from this flows the prima facie principle of an irreversible and universal call to the moral life. This is a foundational conviction, and it has withstood centuries. This is something that we as Christians have believed. It has survived ecumenical councils, and it has been perpetually ratified and reiterated in the magisterial teaching. Emanating from the covenantal relationship humanity has with God and the natural law which is intrinsic to it, we have a reciprocal set of moral obligations which exist between persons, and this is binding from the first moment of existence. The divine image is present in every man. It shines forth in the communion of persons in the likeness of the union of the divine persons among themselves. This is a mystical relationship. This covenantal relationship is a reflection of the unity of the most holy Trinity and the communion of divine persons contained within it. The Catechism of the Catholic Church reiterates this codification of this ancient truth. The divine image is present in every man. The human person is the summit of God's creation, and in it, the human person shines the glory that God shines forth as a reflection of his handiwork, sharing the image and likeness of the Blessed Trinity by a unified moment of grace. As human persons, we are positively compelled by a set of correlative moral obligations, which are anchored in the covenantal relationship. We have obligations because we have this covenantal relationship with God, because we are created in his image and likeness. We are intimately bound to God by these obligations and by the fact that we are created in his image and likeness. But we are also bound to our brothers and sisters. We are inscribed indelibly with the Imago Dei, and so are they. The human person owes an obligation not only to God, who created him, but also we owe an obligation to all other human persons who are likewise created bearing the image of the divine image and likeness. Our dignity, the dignity of the human person, rests above all on the fact that he is called to communion with God. Gaudium et Spes articulates this. The invitation to converse with God is addressed to man as soon as he comes into being, from that first instant. For if man exists, it is because God has created him through love, and through love continues to hold him in existence. He cannot live fully according to truth unless he freely acknowledges love and entrusts himself to its creator. Man's life comes from God. It is his gift, his image, his imprint, a sharing in his breath and life. Therefore, God is the sole Lord of life, and man cannot do with his life as he wills. God makes this clear to Noah after the flood, and he states, "For your own blood too, I will demand an accounting. And from man, in regard to his fellow man, I will demand an accounting of human life." The biblical text is concerned to emphasize how the sacredness of life has at its foundation in God and in his creative activity, for God made man in his own image and likeness. And this is a quote from Evangelii Vitae, paragraph 39. The summit of this teaching is found with regard to the moral law governing marriage and the sacred gift of the transmission of human life. It is through holy matrimony that man and woman are united sacramentally and invited to participate in love as co-workers in God's creative act of transmitting his image and likeness to a new creature. By virtue of the covenantal relationship man has with his creator, bearing the image of the Imago Dei within his very being, the human person is given dominion and a shared lordship. However, the power that has been granted to him by his creator is not indefinite. It is not infinite. Each human person will have to give an accounting for his or her moral decisions. Pope St. John Paul elucidates this point, stating that the dominion granted by the creator is not an absolute power, nor can anyone speak of the freedom to use and misuse or dispose of a thing as he pleases. The limitation imposed from the beginning by the creator himself shows clearly enough that when it comes to the natural world, we are subject not only to biological laws, but we are also subject to moral laws which cannot be violated with impunity. Every child has the right to be conceived in love as a gift from God, given in love through the intimate union of his or her parents, to be respected as a person created in the image and likeness of God from the first moment of existence. Even this loving, creative union of hearts and bodies, there are moral considerations. The church teaches us that marriage is then not an effect of chance or the product of evolution of unconscious natural forces. It is a wise institution of the Creator to realize in mankind his design of love. Among the teachings of the church regarding the transmission of human life that are the most loudly contested by contemporary culture is the fundamental premise of the inseparability of the dual meaning of the marital embrace, both in its unitive and its procreative function. Pope Paul VI reiterates this foundational teaching. The teaching, often set forth by the magisterium, is founded upon an inseparable connection, willed by God, and unable to be broken by man of his own initiative, between the two meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive meaning and the procreative meaning. It is indeed a very intimate structure, the conjugal act, which closely unites the husband and wife and capacitates them for the generation of new lives according to the laws inscribed in the very being of man and woman. The intimate process by which human life is transmitted is not accidental. It is ordained by God. And as Pope Paul VI delineates, it is a divinely ordained process which is inscribed by natural law in the very fiber, in the very being of man and woman, husband and wife, and thus transmitted in love to their progeny as well. The church is not uncompassionate with regard to the grief of fertility. However, she recognizes the inviolable dignity both of the marriage bond and of the tiny human person who is desired. The church's teaching regarding the sanctity of human life has been articulated, promulgated, and reiterated long before contemporary advancements in science and technology presented the opportunity to create life, human life, in vitro. Over the centuries, the church has remained stalwart in her defense of the tiniest of human lives. As Pope St. John Paul argues, the New Testament revelation confirms the indisputable recognition of the human life from its very beginning. The value of the person from the moment of conception is celebrated in the meeting of the Virgin Mary and Elizabeth, and between the two children whom they carry in their womb. In contemporary times, the magisterium has remained faithful, fearlessly preaching the gospel of life amid a technological revolution which obscures the dignity and the sacredness of human life. In upholding her sacred tradition while fulfilling her authoritative pedagogical role, the Church continues to exercise her duty to provide moral leadership grounded in the teachings of Jesus Christ. The human person is a good and is a good in and of himself, and his integral development should always be sought. Love for all, since it's sincere and naturally tends to become preferential, attention to the weakest and the poorest. In this vein, we find the Church's concern for the unborn, the most fragile, and the most threatened by selfish adults and the darkening of consciences. The Church continues to reiterate what it has declared by the Second Vatican Council against abortion and all violations of unborn life from the moment of its conception must be guarded with the greatest of care. This slide is, this quote here is from the November 27th, 2010 First Papal Vigil for Nascent Human Life held by Pope Benedict XVI at St. Peter's Basilica. This is an excerpt from his homily. The documents Dignitas Personae and Donum Vitae most specifically address the Church's teaching regarding artificial reproductive technologies and the threats they pose to human dignity and the sanctity of human life, and ultimately to the common good. While medical science and biological technology have undoubtedly contributed much to human flourishing, there is a temptation to push the envelope, to engage in experimental excess merely for the sake of intellectual curiosity or personal scientific pride. Scientific hubris is not only sinful, but it is downright dangerous for humanity. We recognize that each and every one of us is endowed with a spiritual and immortal soul, and that the human person is the only creature that God has willed for its own sake. Thus, from his conception, he is eternally destined for beatitude. Delineating those procedures, which now not only assist reproduction, but also enable man to dominate the process of procreation, Dignitas Personae warns that these techniques that can enable man to take in his hands his own destiny, but they also expose him to the temptation to go beyond the limits of reasonable dominion over nature. In Dignitas Personae, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger delineated 3 criteria upon which moral judgment regarding the application of medical and biological sciences and the beginnings of life ought to be based. He argued that the criteria are respect, defense, and promotion of man in his primary and fundamental right to life, his dignity as a person endowed with a spiritual soul, with a moral responsibility, and who is called to a beatific communion with God. The document states that scientific research and its applications are not morally neutral, and that this is particularly evident when one considers artificial reproductive technologies. He established 3 conditions of licit fertility treatments. First, the right to life and the physical integrity of every human being from conception to natural death. The unity of marriage, which means a reciprocal respect for the right within marriage to become a father or a mother only together with the other spouse, and specifically human values of sexuality, which require that procreation of a human person be brought about as the fruit of a conjugal act, specific to the love between spouses. Dignitas Personae unambiguously articulates that every human person must be respected as a person from the first instant of his existence. This fundamental point of doctrine serves as the criterion upon which subsequent problems posed by the biomedical sciences are considered. Unequivocally reiterated, the document affirms the fruit of human generation from the first moment of its existence, that is to say, from the moment the zygote is formed, demands the unconditional respect that is morally due the human being in his bodily and spiritual totality. The first and fundamental right of every innocent human person is the inviolable right to life. This right is not contingent upon prenatal diagnosis or desired screening qualities. When we look at IVF, Dr. Turczynski did a phenomenal job explaining what IVF is. The creation of human embryos within a laboratory procedure, the harvesting of ova from a woman and sperm from a man, and the fertilization of ova and sperm outside of a body, generally in a laboratory. I say outside because there's now, I'm going to show you a slide in a little bit, InvoCell, which allows the sperm and the egg to be placed in a tiny capsule and reinserted into the woman so that the conception takes place in her body, but still with gametes that have been taken out. This has been touted as a way of bypassing certain ethical qualms, but in reality, this practice is equally abhorrent. Therefore, it is illicit and morally repugnant to sort human beings based on an arbitrary valuation of biological markers. We look at the human person in its most vulnerable and tiniest stages, and we know that God's plan is present there from the very beginning. Procedures like blastocyst grading and pre-implantation genetic testing that occur daily in artificial reproductive technology laboratories are illicit and an affront to the dignity of the tiny human person who has been artificially created in vitro. Pre-implantation genetic screening and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis involves the biopsy of an embryo to screen for chromosomal abnormalities and genetic conditions. So a single cell is removed from the embryo for the biopsy, and the procedure itself poses a risk to the embryo. Likewise, the technique of cryopreservation of embryos is of grave concern. Dignitas Personae reaffirms the work of Donum Vitae, stating that the freezing of embryos, this is Donum Vitae, the freezing of embryos, even when carried out in order to preserve the life of an embryo, constitutes an offense against the respect due to human beings by exposing them to grave risks of death or harm to their physical integrity and depriving them, at least temporarily, of maternal shelter and gestation and placing them in a situation in which further offenses and manipulation are possible. Dr. Turczynski did an awesome job delineating the new research which shows the long-term ramifications, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later, health issues that seem to occur because potentially of the cryopreservation or the process of the laboratory. Cryopreservation is incompatible with the respect we owe human embryos. It presupposes their production in vitro. It exposes them to serious risks and physical harm. A high percentage do not survive the process of freeze thawing. It deprives them of the maternal reception and gestation. Among the most egregious harms that result from cryopreservation of embryos are the millions who are abandoned. The problem of what to do with the leftover embryos is enormous. It is heartbreaking, and it underscores the complex moral quandaries which arise when moral laws are broken, and that hallowed dignity of human persons is abrogated by those who wish to treat them as a means to an end rather than sacred ends in themselves. No one knows how many frozen embryos are lost or destroyed each year. One of the things that I found shocking when I first began to delve into this years ago with the help of Laura Elm at the time was the voluntary reporting in this country and in others regarding what happens in the laboratories. So we truly have no idea. We have a guesstimate, but we have no idea how many embryos are being created and how many are being frozen and how many are being used in research and destroyed. The connection between in vitro fertilization and the voluntary destruction of human embryos occurs too often. This is significant. Through these procedures, which apparently contrary purposes, life and death are subjected to the decision of man, who thus sets himself up as the giver of life and death by decree. Donum Vitae. This is an article from 2012. At that point, this is from a publication in Great Britain. 1.7 million embryos that were created for IVF had been thrown away, and only 7% were determined to lead to pregnancy. 93% of those that were created between 1991 and 2012 were never used. As a result, 93% of all embryos created, more than 3.3 million in all, were never used to generate a pregnancy. Of the embryos created, 839,325 were put in future storage, and 2,000 were stored for donation to others. 5,876 were set aside for scientific research. This is the InvoCell that I had mentioned before. The culture holds eggs and sperm. It's small, it's about 1.5 inches tall, and it comes with a retention device so that eggs and sperm are mixed and placed inside the woman because it's recognized that the woman is the best incubator. Then the device is expelled and the pre-implantation testing, culture continue. The best embryos are chosen. The others are either discarded or frozen. Donum Vitae tells us that attempts to influence the chromosomic or genetic inheritance that are not therapeutic, but aimed at selection of the best, the best human persons for predetermined qualities. These manipulations are contrary to the personal dignity of the human being and his or her integrity. No way can these be justified on the grounds of any possible benefit, any possible future consequences for humanity. We know that every person must be respected for himself. This consists the dignity and the right of every human being from his or her beginning. Another thing that is addressed in these documents is surrogate motherhood. Surrogate motherhood represents an objective failure to meet the obligations of maternal love and of conjugal fidelity and of responsible motherhood. It offends the dignity and the right of the child to be conceived, to be carried in the womb, brought up in the world, brought up by one's own parents. It sets up to the detriment of families a division between the physical, psychological, and moral elements. The teaching of Donum Vitae remains completely valid. This was articulated in the document Dignitas Personae. As Dr. Turczynski mentioned, when we mess with God's plan, we're left with some pretty messy circumstances. We end up with situations like this where we have a oldest baby born. She had been frozen for 28 years and is nearly as old as her mother chronologically. Likewise, there are many cases where the fertility doctor uses his own sperm. Saw all sorts of documents, clips where folks use the chromosome studies to find out what their genetic lineage is, and found out that they had siblings out there, but their siblings were conceived in a laboratory, and that the common father was the laboratory doctor. One example is this Michigan doctor who used his sperm and fathered what is believed to be about 1,000 babies. There's a lot of stories out there. This creates all sorts of complex moral dilemmas. We also have the rule regarding the creation of embryos for research. The envelope is being pushed. Before, the commonly accepted rule was that embryos must be destroyed at 14 days if they're going to be used in research. And now that has been pushed and pushed and pushed. And the time limit on lab-grown human embryos is being relaxed. And we are entering a phase of some really frightening experiments on the human person. He Zhenqi genetically altered via CRISPR a pair of twin girls, Lulu and Nana. He had hoped that he was knocking out the gene that would make one susceptible to HIV, but he did this without the consent of the girls or of their parents. He did this without the consent of his institution, demonstrating how very easy it is for one to genetically manipulate children in the laboratory. It was a dangerous experiment. Techniques of fertilization in vitro can open the way to other forms of biological and genetic manipulation of human embryos, such as attempts or plans for fertilization between human and animal gametes and the gestation of human embryos in the uterus of animals, or the hypothesis or project of constructing artificial uteruses for the human embryo. These procedures are contrary to human dignity, proper to the embryo, and at the same time, they are contrary to the right of every person to be conceived and to be born within marriage. From decades of suspended animation while frozen in liquid nitrogen, to compassionate thawing, to dissection and dismemberment in experimental biological research, it is self-evident that none of these options are compatible with the dignity owed human persons made in the image and likeness of God. We now have potential dispositions for unwanted embryos in experimental biological research. Everything from use in transhuman chimeras, that is the creation of part animal, part human, part pig, often with the utilitarian carrot of being used for organ transplantation. Human life is sacred, and the Church reminds us that the ethical value of biomedical science is gauged in reference to both the unconditional respect owed every human person at every moment of his or her existence and the defense of specific character of the personal act which transmits life. The two dimensions of life, the natural and the supernatural, allow us to understand better the sense in which the acts that permit a new human being to come into existence, in which man and a woman give themselves to each other, are a reflection of the Trinitarian love. God, who is love and life, has inscribed in man and woman the vocation to share in a special way his mystery of personal communion, and his work as creator and father. Human life is sacred. We are made in the image and likeness of God, and each and every person has an incomparable worth and dignity. Each one of us was created by love for love. Each of us was created to have an eternal destiny, to be with love itself. And we need to choose to act in accordance with the image and likeness of God that we bear. It is part of the sacred covenant that we have by virtue of bearing that image and likeness. In the end, the way we treat the most vulnerable among us speaks volumes about who we are. I love this scriptural passage from Deuteronomy. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you and your children may live. Thank you for letting me speak to you today.
Thank you, Dr. Urlakis, for speaking with us and for sharing your excellent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Urlakis, for speaking with us and for sharing your excellent presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Moffat.
To begin our Q&A session, Laura Elm will be leading us. Laura is the director and founder of Sacred Heart Guardians and Shelter, an organization whose mission is to provide burial for the human embryos whose lives start and end in IVF laboratories. Laura has been interviewed on Relevant Radio and WCAT Radio. She has been featured in The Catholic Spirit and published in the National Catholic Bioethics Center's newsletter, Ethics and Medics. Laura is a wife, a mom, and works full-time in the pharmaceutical industry. She earned her MBA from the University of Minnesota and previously worked in product management for a national health insurer. It's all yours, Laura. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sebastian, for the introduction. And thank you, Dr. Turczynski and Dr. Urlakis, for two very excellent, informative, and moving presentations. We've got some great questions today. I'm going to start first with a technical one for Dr. Turczynski. But before I do, I'm just going to remind everybody, the link, I believe, is in the chat now, too. If you'd like to get access to Dr. Craig Turczynski's article, there is a link to it that can be found in Webinar Resources, the section of the ITEST webpage, and then the link is in chat. The article is titled Assisted Reproductive Technology and Natural Law, How 7 Years as an Embryologist Revealed IVF's Disordered Approach to Patient Care. And the authors on that are Dr. Turczynski, Alexa Dodd, and Dr. Urlakis. So Dr. Turczynski, there's a question about the visual grading of human embryos. The question goes, do any apparent malformations bear weight in how they'll develop? Or because they're so young at that point, is this more subjective and more of a discrimination? In my experience, too, I've seen, just kind of watching the industry from a distance, I know you get a chance to watch it more closely, the idea of which embryos to select for implantation the technology around that really continues to evolve, looking for the very best way to decide which embryo to transfer. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So it's evolving, as you mentioned. It is an imperfect kind of subjective analysis. There are some things that we understand about embryo viability at that stage. We can look at things like fragmentation, the symmetry of the blastomeres, if there's vacuoles, kind of graininess in the blastomeres. So there are some things that we can look at that we know can relate to a more viable or a non-viable embryo, but it's very imperfect. The field obviously has tried to use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to get at what is a viable embryo and not. It was being heavily pursued, but now there's questions regarding that because of the amazing ability the embryo has to self-correct. So for instance, if you have an 8-cell embryo and some of the cells are aneuploid, so they're not normal ploidy, and some of them are normal, so it's a mosaic embryo. The embryo has the capacity to push those abnormal cells out into the trophectoderm, which becomes the placenta, and then only multiply the ones that are normal. So they're finding that even though these embryos at this stage they can biopsy a cell or two and get abnormal cells, it doesn't mean that embryo is not viable because it can self-correct. So that procedure is being questioned. One of the things that I'm seeing talked about a lot now is using artificial intelligence. So that would be, for instance, computerized analysis of videography to look at how the embryo is developing. And we know that a very vibrant embryo should divide in a certain amount of time. And if it's delayed, then that would also be indicative of the viability of the embryo. But none of it is perfect. In the paper, I share a story about, at the very beginning, about a couple where the man had zero motile sperm. He had sperm. They were all very abnormal looking at, and none of them were motile. So we did ICSI with that sperm for the couple, and we got fertilized embryos. The embryos were the least viable looking embryos I had ever seen. I had no doubt in my mind that they were not going to result in a pregnancy, but they did. They resulted in pregnancy. I don't know the health. Actually, I don't even know if they went to term. I do know that they have a positive pregnancy test and ultrasound that then they were referred on. But it just goes to show you that we don't really ultimately know what makes a viable embryo. And as I pointed out earlier, there's always room for a miracle that defies science.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Turczynski. Dr. Marianne, I'm going to ask you this one, and it has to do with some terminology that is used in the context of IVF and also in just regular gestation and pregnancies. And it's subtle, but it's important for us to understand some of the distinctions. And the question is around, or the comment I should say, is around the redefinition of conception in 1962, and where fertilization compared to conception, compared to implantation. Can you comment a little bit on some of the distinctions between those terminologies? And if you have guidance for us as to how to talk about life in its very earliest stage, if we should be using fertilization or conception?
That's a great question. And honestly, Laura, I think that's a question that you may be more equipped to answer than I am. So I'd like to share this one with you as well. Words have meanings, as you say, and some of the redefinition has been for agendas. Also, as the technology allows us to have a greater window into what is really happening, it becomes clearer that from that first instant, there is unique DNA. There is somebody unique right there. What are your thoughts on this, Laura, as I formulate my own?
Again, not a doctor, but, I do have some thoughts, and, even in the interest of having a little discussion, I'd like to know what Dr. Turczynski thinks if ICSI always results in fertilization. For me, I use fertilization. I don't use conception. And I oftentimes, when I am engaging with the staff at IVF clinics, I refer to the embryo as the embryonic human being. So I really try and humanize the embryo as much as I can. And like Dr. Turczynski said earlier, this is kind of startling to the staff at these clinics, to refer to an embryo as not just a human embryo, but as an actual human being, and to use humanizing language. But I do use fertilization because it has, in my non-scientific perspective, it sounds more clinical. Conception sometimes sounds a little bit more religious. And so when I'm talking to the IVF staff, I'm usually talking about fertilization, insemination. The other term that I do hear from IVF clinics is, and I don't know where this term originated from, again, getting into the nitty-gritty of the terminology when we're talking about, the age of these embryonic human beings is so specific. Embryo, some people don't recognize an embryo until implantation. Prior to that, it's a pre-embryo, is what they would say. I've, read other things where it's very clear that pre-embryo is kind of a made-up term, because before embryo, there isn't anything before an embryo. An embryo is as young as you can get. But you can further divide that embryo into like zygote in the one-cell stage, the blastocyst, the morula at the 3-day stage. And so you can get real specific to determine the age of these embryos. But again, I usually will, even if I'm talking to the clinic, zygotic human being, embryonic human being. But I do use fertilization rather than conception, because I think sometimes the IVF world is pretty secular, and conception starts to kind of cast a religious overtone, in my opinion. So I use the word uterus instead of womb, fertilization instead of conception, to try and be more, at least sound a little bit more biologically and scientifically sound to a secular world.
Yeah. So to answer your question, Laura, about ICSI almost guarantees fertilization. Fertilization rate will be somewhere around 90% if the procedure is performed correctly. And then in terms of, I guess what we're getting at is what makes the most sense for the start of the human life, defining the human life. And fertilization is a very distinct biological process, right? When the pronucleus from the egg and the decondensed pronucleus from the sperm fuse, it's called syngamy. That whole process is just an amazing process. And even when the sperm first enter the paravitelline space and bind to ooplasm of the egg, the cortical granules release enzymes that then seal the zona pellucida to keep additional sperm from getting on. It's just an amazing event that happens the time that sperm meets egg. And to me, it does make the most sense. Conception is kind of a vague term, and people can define it whatever they want to, but fertilization is really the start of the human life.
Wonderful. Looking through, we've got some really great questions here too, that I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to all of them. But one of the things that has come through is around talking with people who are considering IVF. You know, this comes from a pastoral care perspective, from somebody who's currently in seminary. But I think it's applicable to all of us when we're talking with people who are in the desperate circumstances of infertility and don't know what to do. And obviously desperation and time sensitivity can really cloud people's judgment, and they're not thinking in ways that they would otherwise. But, you know, in your experience, and I'll put this to Marianne, I'll put this to you first. When couples are meeting with pastoral care, or we have somebody in our family, based on your experience, do you have any practical pointers that you can recommend to talk to them about? And maybe Dr. Turczynski too, I can ask you after Marianne comments about, you know, alternatives that are out there, credible alternatives to help them with. Obviously, I think the first thing anybody would want to do is listen, you know, just listen. But Dr. Urlakis, how about if you go first and give some pointers?
Thank you. It is heartbreaking to be in the position of infertility. And I think that this is when the church, when we as church have the ability to show the face of the compassion of Christ. And I think the couple must be approached with that in mind. And Laura, you raise an excellent point. Just listening. For them to have gotten to this point, there is trauma. There is emotional trauma. There are dreams that are broken. There are hopes that are broken. And we need to be compassionate, to listen, and to find out what they know. What do they know in terms of both the science, and what do they know in terms of what the church teaches? There are some great documents out there. And I think we need to be able to get those documents into the hands of those that are grappling with these questions. They need to know exactly what the church's teaching is. It's a beautiful teaching. So I think in terms of the seminarian who is posing the question, I think the seminarian himself needs to be able to take the time to look at the documents, look at the science, see what's out there, and to approach the couple with compassion. I also think that as I look at, you know, after being on the board of Sacred Heart Guardians and Shelter and working with you for these past several years, you have so many couples who have come to you and said, I wish we would have known. I wish we would have known. We were young, we were caught up in the hype, and we were desperate, and we made decisions that we never would have made if we had been fully informed. I am a big proponent of informed consent. And in this industry, I see that informed consent is often lacking. So I would take the time to make sure that the couple is fully informed. Dr. Turczynski?
Yeah, so in regards to consulting couples who are contemplating this, I think you first have to start with understanding where they are in their faith journey. I have couples who come to me on My Catholic Doctor. Some of them are very firm in their faith and they want to follow church teaching. Others are either not very firm in their faith, or they're not even Catholic. And through natural law, the light of reason, they have also identified that there's just something not right about this. But depending on where they are is to me where you start. I think the fact that IVF causes harm to society, to the woman, to the relationship, and to children born from it is a good place to start. Because that's practical. They don't want harm. They don't want to put themselves or the child, probably most of all, they don't want something to affect the child. So I think that's a very good place to start with them.
That's wonderful. Somebody had asked a question about for individuals who have gone through IVF and who have that crisis of conscience, like you said, Dr. Turczynski, they share that they were young, they were desperate, they didn't know. The question is what usually instigates their regret over IVF from our experience. I have a little bit of experience in this, and it's usually years after they've had children born who were conceived with IVF. They're done bearing children, and they still have embryos in frozen storage. That usually is the point of that crisis of conscience. And it's a horrible place for these families to be. I think we only have a minute left here for questions. So I want to end on a really positive note. It's been an honor to moderate the Q&A, but I want to talk about hope. And sometimes this seems like a really crazy, hopeless, sci-fi, unbelievable situation in the world of assisted reproductive technology. But Dr. Urlakis, can you talk a little bit about hope for us?
Our faith teaches us that there is always hope, and our hope is in Jesus Christ. And I think man has made a mess of this by trying to play God. But when we remember that God is God, and we put things in perspective, there is nothing that is beyond him. Dr. Turczynski talks about the miracles. There is nothing that is beyond him. We look at the millions of embryos of human persons, our brothers and sisters, that are in suspended animation, frozen. That can be daunting and almost hopeless. But every one of those is loved by Almighty God, created in his image and likeness. There is hope there. There is hope that our Lord will enlighten us if we can begin to turn to him, to earnestly submit our will to his divine will, and to ask for him to enlighten our intellects, to inform our consciences, and to motivate us to following his divine plan.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sebastian.
Thank you so very much, Laura, for moderating the Q&A. And I'd like to thank everybody else for their participation in this webinar, especially our presenters, Dr. Craig Turczynski and Dr. Anne Urlakis. In conclusion, Sister Clara Mohilia Roche will offer our closing prayer. Sister Mohilia is an apostle of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in St. Louis. She teaches high school theology and enjoys learning more in the field to integrate with daily living in educating her students and herself. Sister Clara Mohilia.
Thank you, Sebastian. And just to reiterate all of the thoughts that were expressed today and for the perspectives that we got that enlighten us more in our faith. In closing, I want us to remember maybe one thought or one perspective that probably was new to us that we can carry with us to the people that we meet as we end in prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Gracious Father, you have given us the gifts to understand and to learn more about you and to understand more in the perplexity of life, this mystery of life, the gift of life that you have given us. Thank you for our presenters today, for their gift and their knowledge that they have shared with us. And to the gifts of the Holy Spirit, may each one of us take a portion of this that we can expand on, grow in knowledge of, and share with your people, whether that be in the classroom, on the streets, or in our own daily lives. And we ask this as we ask all things through your name and through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.